Hey everybody, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the clavicle in this video. The clavicle doesn't have a ton of structures. It's relatively simple in terms of how many items there are for us to learn, but it's still a really interesting bone. One of the most interesting things about it is that it really is the only bone-on-bone attachment of our arm to our body, or to our axial skeleton at least. So if you look, if we zoom out a little bit, we can see here's our humerus and our arm attached to the scapula. The scapula does not have a direct attachment to our axial skeleton. It actually floats on top of our ribs. There's quite a bit of muscles that hold it in place, so it's not entirely unstable, but it doesn't have a bone-on-bone attachment like the clavicle does right here at the sternoclavicular joint. So if you have ever known someone who's broken their clavicle, it's probably been by falling on their hand. They went to catch themselves with their hands hit the ground, and all that force went up through the clavicle. So typically a fall on an outstretched hand could cause an AC joint separation, which is this joint right here, or a clavicular fracture. Let's go ahead and take a look at just the clavicle and look at some structures. Let's first appreciate that it has two ends. It has a acromial end and a sternal end. The acromial end is very flat and attaches to the acromion. The sternal end is rounder in appearance, at least at the articular surface, and it attaches to the sternum, specifically the manubrium. So this facet right here is the facet that attaches to the sternum, and it's called the sternal facet. Sternal facet. Specifically, it attaches to the clavicular facets on the manubrium, which is a part of the sternum, so we call it the sternal facet. If we look inferiorly, and let's see if we can get rid of this green here. If we look inferiorly, there is a roughened patch right, sorry for this guys, right there. So you can kind of see that this area is rough. And that's called the costal tuberosity. Costal means pertaining to the rib, and it just so happens that rib 1 is right underneath here, which is part of why it's called the costal tuberosity. All right, let's go ahead and look at the shaft of the clavicle. Now the shaft is just the region between the sternal end and the acromial end, and you can see that it is convex posteriorly on the lateral 1/3, and it's convex anteriorly on the medial 2/3. Now that's not really something I would test you on, but it is helpful if you're ever asked to differentiate between a left or a right, which is kind of harder than you might expect without some knowledge of the shape of the clavicle. There's only one structure on the shaft. It's called the subclavian groove. Now, it's not that easy to see even on a real bone, but it's even less easy to see on this model. So what we might do, I'm going to try to add in the muscles, and you'll see why it's called the subclavian groove. So let's slowly start adding some muscles in. There you go, boom. So that's the subclavius muscle, and it does leave a mark on the clavicle. So I'm going to go ahead and hide this. And that area where it was attached, right in here, is called the subclavian groove. All right, that brings us to the acromial end. So the first thing we'll talk about is this structure right here called the conoid tubercle. It's named after a ligament that attaches there. Conoid tubercle. It's actually one of the easier things to see on the clavicle. It's very important when determining left and right because it if it's positioned correctly, it should be pointing back and actually slightly down. This isn't as inferior as I'm used to seeing, but you still can kind of see it's pointed like this. When it's positioned correctly, it will point like that. So if you're manipulating a clavicle and trying to determine if it's a left or a right, this would be a helpful feature for you to know about. Again, that's the that's the conoid tubercle. The next structure we'll look at is the deltoid tubercle. Again, it's not super visible here, so we're going off of location. It's very lateral and it's anterior. It's right here. And if you can picture, let's bring back the bones. If you can picture where your deltoid muscle is, you can imagine it's going to kind of be like this, sort of. And so that's where it gets its name, is the relationship to the deltoid. That's a deltoid attachment. And let's actually try to see if we can see that. I was afraid of that. So let's hide that. There you go. That's pretty good, actually. So you can see the anterior deltoid takes some of its origin. Not sure where my marker went. You can see that the anterior deltoid takes some of its origin off of that lateral anterior clavicle area, so right in here, which is the deltoid tubercle. And we have one more structure. Let's go ahead and remove these muscles. It's right here, and you can actually see it even with the acromion in place, but let's go ahead and hide everything. This lateral end of the clavicle, the acromial end, it's called the acromial end because it articulates with the acromion. Specifically, this smooth facet right here does, and that's called the acromial facet. And that is it for the clavicle, everybody. Thank you.